He'd built an empire on ice and indifference, turning his heart to stone the night his father's blood painted the marble floor of their Seoul penthouse. For 12 years, Kang Min-ho hadn't looked at a woman as anything more than a transaction, a distraction, or a threat. His world was clean, controlled, calculated, every move orchestrated like the crime syndicate he commanded with ruthless precision. Then she walked into the presidential suite of the Grand Lotus Hotel, carrying fresh towels and a smile that didn't belong in his cold universe, and something he'd buried alongside his father's memory clawed its way back to life. The curvy black woman with kind eyes didn't know she just shattered the armor of Seoul's most dangerous man, didn't know that the moment she asked if he needed anything else, his answer had already become everything. Welcome to Story World, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Min-ho stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grand Lotus Hotel's presidential suite, watching Seoul's nighttime skyline bleed neon into darkness. Behind him, his lieutenants discussed expansion territories and rival syndicate movements, their voices a familiar drone he'd learned to filter like white noise. He was 34, controlled half of Seoul's underground economy, and felt absolutely nothing about any of it anymore. Power was maintenance. Control was survival. Emotion was the luxury that got his father killed. The door opened without his permission, which meant housekeeping had ignored the privacy notice he'd specifically requested. Irritation flickered through him, the first genuine feeling he'd had in days. He turned, ready to have someone fired, and the words died in his throat. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the polished, manufactured perfection he'd grown numb to. Curvy, with rich brown skin that caught the amber lamplight, hair pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized elegant features and eyes that held warmth he'd forgotten existed. She wore the hotel's standard housekeeping uniform, but something about the way she carried herself made it look like a choice rather than a requirement. "I'm so sorry," she said immediately, genuine apology in her voice with a slight American accent. "I was told this suite requested evening turn-down service. If that's incorrect, I can come back later." Min-ho's lieutenants had gone silent, watching the exchange with the wariness of men who knew their boss's moods could turn lethal without warning. He should dismiss her, should have her supervisor reprimanded for the intrusion. Instead, he heard himself say, "It's fine. Continue." She hesitated, clearly sensing the tension in the room, then moved with quiet efficiency toward the bedroom area. His men exchanged glances, confused by his uncharacteristic tolerance. Min-ho ignored them, his attention tracking her movements with an intensity that surprised him. The meeting resumed, but he absorbed nothing. He was aware of her in the next room, the soft sounds of fabric being smoothed, pillows being arranged, the faint scent of lavender from whatever cleaning products she used. When she emerged 10 minutes later, she offered a small, professional smile that did something strange to his chest. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked, and the question felt loaded with possibilities he had no right to consider. "No," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Thank you." She nodded and turned to leave. He watched her reach the door, watched her hand touch the handle, and felt something crack open inside him that he'd sealed shut 12 years ago when he'd held his dying father and promised to never be weak again. "Wait," the word came out before he could stop it. She turned back, patient, curious. "Yes, sir." "What's your name?" It wasn't really a question, but she answered anyway. "Simone. I'm new to Seoul, just started at the hotel last month." "American," he stated. "From Atlanta originally." Her smile widened slightly. "Still getting used to the city, but I love it here." His lieutenants were stirring now, no longer pretending to discuss business. Min-ho didn't care. "Why Seoul?" he asked. "Fresh start," she said simply, and something in her eyes suggested there was a story there, one that involved pain she'd left an ocean away to escape. Sometimes you need distance to become who you're meant to be. The words hit harder than they should have. Min-ho had never had the luxury of running, had instead become exactly what his father's death demanded he become. Looking at this woman who'd chosen reinvention over resignation, he felt the weight of that difference. "Enjoy your evening," Simone said when he didn't respond, and this time he let her leave. The moment the door closed, his head of security spoke carefully. "Boss, do you want her background checked?" "No," Min-ho said, turning back to the window. Then, after a pause, "Yes, but discreetly. She's not to know." Later that night, Minho couldn't sleep. He stood in the same spot by the windows, remembering the warmth in Simone's eyes, the genuine quality of her smile. His phone buzzed with the preliminary background report. Simone Clark, 28, hotel employee visa, clean record, left Atlanta 6 months ago after a difficult divorce. No criminal connections, no red flags, just a woman trying to rebuild her life in a foreign country. He should delete the file and forget about her. Instead, he found himself requesting her work schedule. The next morning, Minho did something he hadn't done in years. He canceled his meetings and stayed at the hotel. His men thought he was planning something, strategizing some elaborate power play. In reality, he was waiting for housekeeping rounds like a teenager with his first crush, and the realization disgusted and intrigued him in equal measure. Simone arrived at his suite at precisely 2 in the afternoon, her knock professional and polite. When he opened the door himself instead of having security handle it, surprise flickered across her features. "Mr. Kang," she said, clearly having learned his name from hotel records. "I can come back if this is a bad time." "It's not," he said, stepping aside. "Please come in." She entered cautiously, her professionalism a shield he recognized because he wore the same armor daily. As she worked, he pretended to answer emails on his laptop while actually watching her reflection in the window glass. She moved with efficient grace, humming softly under her breath, completely unaware that Seoul's most dangerous crime lord was cataloging every detail about her like a man obsessed. "You've been in Seoul a month," he said abruptly. "How are you finding it?" She glanced over, clearly not expecting conversation. "It's beautiful," she said. "Different from home, but in good ways. People here have been kind mostly." "Mostly," he repeated. She shrugged, a small gesture that somehow conveyed volumes. There's always adjustment. Language barriers, cultural differences, moments where you feel very alone in a crowded city. But that's part of the adventure, right? "Is it lonely?" The question came out before he could filter it. Too personal, too revealing. Simone stopped what she was doing and looked at him directly. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I've learned that lonely and alone aren't the same thing. You can be surrounded by people and still feel isolated. Or you can be by yourself and feel completely whole." "Wisdom from experience," he observed. Hard-earned, she confirmed with a slight smile that held shadows he wanted to chase away. They fell into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. When she finished and gathered her supplies, Minho stood. "Have dinner with me," he said. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Dinner," he repeated. "Tonight. There's a restaurant I think you'd enjoy." "Mr. Kang," she said carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think that would be appropriate. You're a guest, I'm hotel staff. There are professional boundaries." "I'm not asking as a guest," he said, moving closer but maintaining respectful distance. "I'm asking as someone who would like to get to know you better outside the context of hotel protocols and housekeeping schedules." She studied him, and he forced himself to remain still under her scrutiny, to let her see whatever she needed to see to trust him. "Finally," she said, "one dinner, somewhere public, and I pay for my own meal." "Deal," he agreed, though he had no intention of letting her pay for anything ever again. That evening, Minho took Simone to a traditional Korean restaurant in Insadong, far from his usual haunts where syndicate affiliates might recognize him. He'd told his security to maintain invisible distance, wanting this to feel normal even though nothing about his life had been normal since he was 22 and inherited an empire built on blood. "This is beautiful," Simone said, looking around at the Hanok-style interior with genuine appreciation. "Thank you for bringing me here." "You said you wanted to experience Seoul," he replied. This felt like a good start. Over bulgogi and soju that she sipped cautiously, they talked. She told him about Atlanta, about working her way through college, about a marriage that had slowly suffocated her spirit until leaving became survival. He listened, really listened, in ways he hadn't listened to anyone in years. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "What's your story?" Minho considered lying, crafting some sanitized version of his life that wouldn't send her running. Instead, he offered carefully edited truth. "I inherited my family's business young," he said. "Too young. It required becoming someone I'm not sure I was meant to be." "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Every day," he admitted, the confession startling him with its honesty. But regret doesn't change reality. No, she agreed softly, but choice does. You're not stuck being who you were yesterday, Minho. Every moment is a chance to become someone different. She used his given name without the formal honorific, and the intimacy of it did something to him he couldn't name. No one had called him simply Minho in 12 years. Everyone used his title, his position, his power as a buffer between his name and his humanity. You make it sound simple, he said. I make it sound possible, she corrected. There's a difference. Walking her back to her apartment in Itaewon later, Minho felt something he'd thought died with his father. Hope. Not for redemption, exactly, but for the possibility that maybe there was more to existence than the cold accumulation of power and the efficient elimination of threats. At her door, Simone turned to him with a smile that made his chest ache. Thank you for tonight, she said. I haven't felt this normal since moving here. Normal, he repeated, the word tasting foreign. Like a regular person on a regular date having a regular conversation, she clarified. Not the hotel guest and the housekeeper, just two people sharing a meal and stories. Is that what you want, he asked, stepping closer. Normal. She met his gaze steadily. I want authentic, she said, whatever that looks like. He kissed her then, unable to resist the pull any longer, half expecting her to push him away, fully prepared to retreat if she showed any hesitation. Instead, she melted into him, her hands finding his shoulders, her lips soft and warm and absolutely devastating to every defense he'd built. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she whispered, This is probably a terrible idea. Probably, he agreed, resting his forehead against hers. But she invited him inside anyway, and Minho followed her into the small studio apartment that smelled like vanilla candles and felt more like home than anywhere he'd been in 12 years. What happened next was slow and intense, a collision of loneliness and longing that burned away pretense. He touched her like she was precious, like she might disappear if he wasn't careful, and she responded with a passion that matched his own desperate need for connection. Every kiss was a question, every touch an answer, and when they finally came together, it felt like finding something he hadn't known he'd been searching for his entire life. Afterward, lying tangled in her sheets with city lights painting patterns across her skin, Minho felt terror mixing with wonder. This woman had somehow slipped past every wall he'd constructed, had found the human being buried beneath the crime lord, and now he was catastrophically vulnerable in ways that could get them both killed. He should leave, should end this before it became more complicated. Instead, he pulled her closer and let himself pretend, just for tonight, that he was someone who deserved softness. The next morning, Minho woke to an empty bed and the sound of shower running. For a moment, panic seized him, irrational fear that she'd left. That last night had been some beautiful hallucination his lonely mind had conjured. Then Simone emerged wrapped in a towel, her natural hair damp and curling around her face, and relief flooded through him so intensely it was almost painful. Morning, she said, her smile slightly shy but genuine. Morning, he replied, watching her move around the small space with unconscious grace. She made coffee while he pretended to check messages on his phone, both of them navigating the awkward intimacy of the morning after. Finally, she sat beside him on the bed and said, So, we should probably talk about what this is. What do you want it to be? He asked. She considered the question seriously. I like you, she said. A lot. But I'm also aware that I don't really know you, Minho. Last night was incredible, but I need to understand what I'm getting into before this goes further. He should tell her everything. Should explain that he was the head of one of Seoul's most powerful crime syndicates. That being with him meant danger, that people who got close to him had a tendency to become targets. Instead, he said, I want to see you again. And again after that. I want to know everything about you and let you know me in return. Even the parts you keep hidden, she asked quietly. Especially those, he said, meaning it more than she could possibly understand. They spent the day together, Minho ignoring increasingly urgent messages from his lieutenants, while Simone showed him Seoul through a tourist's eyes. They visited Bukshan Hanok village, ate street food in Myeongdong, took selfies at En Seoul Tower that he would never post but would keep forever. For hours, he was just a man falling for a woman, and the freedom of that was intoxicating. But reality reasserted itself that evening, when his head of security finally tracked him down. "Boss, we have a situation," the man said in Korean, careful not to look at Simone standing beside Minho. "The Busan crew is moving on our territory. They hit 3 of our establishments last night. We need you." Minho's jaw tightened. "Handle it," he replied in the same language. "They specifically asked for you. Said if you don't show, they'll keep escalating." Beside him, Simone touched his arm gently. "Is everything okay?" she asked in English. He looked down at her, at the concern in her eyes, and felt the weight of his 2 worlds colliding. "Business," he said. "I have to go." She nodded, but he saw the flash of disappointment she tried to hide. "Okay, will I see you later?" "Yes," he promised, kissing her forehead. "I'll call you." But that night turned into 3 days of violence and negotiation, of reminding Seoul's underworld why Kang Min-ho's name carried weight, why challenging his territory was suicide. By the time he had breathing room, he had 17 missed calls from Simone and a sick feeling that he'd already started losing her. He found her at the hotel, finishing her shift. The smile she gave him when she saw him was warm but guarded, and he hated that he'd put that wariness there. "Hey," she said, "you're alive." "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "Things got complicated." "They always do," she replied, and there was something in her tone that suggested she was talking about more than his 3-day absence. They went to her apartment, and Min-ho tried to explain without really explaining, offered apologies without context, and watched her try to decide if she could trust him. Finally, she said, "I need you to be honest with me, Min-ho. What do you really do?" He could lie, should lie. Instead, he said, "Things I'm not proud of. Things that are necessary but not good. I run businesses that exist in gray areas, and sometimes those areas get dark." "Are you in danger?" she asked. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Are you putting me in danger by being with me?" He wanted to say no, wanted to promise her safety, but he respected her too much to lie. "Potentially," he said quietly, "which is why I'll understand if you want to end this now." Simone was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she said, "I left my entire life behind to start over here, Min-ho. I'm not afraid of complicated or difficult, but I need honesty, and I need you to show up when you say you will. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, pulling her close. "I swear it." She kissed him then, and he poured every ounce of his commitment into showing her what his words couldn't fully convey. That night, they made love again, slower this time, with the weight of understanding between them, and Min-ho silently vowed to protect her from his world even as he bound her more deeply to him. The following weeks fell into a pattern. Min-ho compartmentalized ruthlessly, handling syndicate business with his usual cold efficiency while carving out time with Simone that felt like breathing after being underwater. She didn't ask questions about the bruises that sometimes appeared on his knuckles, didn't press when he took calls in Korean and left the room. In return, he gave her everything else, attention and affection and a tenderness he'd thought died with his capacity for love. His men noticed the change. Their boss smiled occasionally now, checked his phone with anticipation rather than irritation, left meetings early for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy. Some saw it as weakness. His head of security saw it as liability. "Boss, we need to talk about the girl," the man said one morning. "No," Min-ho replied flatly, "we don't. She's a vulnerability, if the other families find out." "They won't," Min-ho cut him off, "because everyone who knows about her values their life more than gossip." The implicit threat hung in the air. His security chief nodded slowly. "Understood. But for what it's worth, I hope she's worth the risk." "She is," Min-ho said with absolute certainty. But the universe had a way of punishing hubris, and Min-ho's came due on a Tuesday evening when he was supposed to meet Simone for dinner. Instead, he got a call that changed everything. "We have your woman," a voice said in Korean. "You have 24 hours to transfer your Gangnam territories, or we start sending pieces of her back to you." The phone went dead. Min-ho stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds, terror and rage warring in his chest. Then he moved, calling his entire organization to arms, mobilizing every resource he had, becoming the monster everyone whispered about but few had actually seen fully unleashed. because someone had made the fatal mistake of touching what was his, and Min-ho was about to remind Seoul why crossing Kang Min-ho meant death. The warehouse district south of the Han River was where Seoul's underworld conducted business that required privacy and easy body disposal. Min-ho arrived with 20 armed men, rage barely contained beneath the cold mask he wore like armor. Every second Simone spent in enemy hands was agony. Every breath he took without knowing if she was hurt felt like betrayal of the promise he'd made to protect her. His phone buzzed with reconnaissance. There in Warehouse 7, his lieutenant reported. Thermal imaging shows 6 hostiles, 1 captive restrained in the center room. Perimeter is light security, they're overconfident. Because they think I'll negotiate, Min-ho said quietly. They're wrong. Boss, maybe we should consider their demands. His head of security began carefully. The Gangnam territory is valuable, but it's not worth. She's worth everything. Min-ho cut him off, his voice lethal. And anyone who thinks otherwise can join the people who took her. The message was clear. They moved in with surgical precision, Min-ho leading despite his men's protests. He needed to be the one who found her, needed to see with his own eyes that she was alive. The first guard went down silently, knife to the throat before he could raise alarm. The second and third followed just as quietly. Min-ho moved through violence with practiced efficiency, each kill cold and necessary, each step bringing him closer to Simone. When he finally kicked open the door to the center room, time seemed to slow. Simone was tied to a chair, her face bruised, blood trailing from a split lip, but her eyes were fierce and alive. Relief hit him so hard his knees almost buckled, immediately followed by volcanic rage at the men who dared mark her skin. Well, the apparent leader said in Korean, smiling with false bravado. The great Kang Min-ho, right on time. Shall we discuss terms? Min-ho shot him between the eyes without breaking stride. The man's body hit the ground as Min-ho killed the remaining guards with brutal efficiency, his movements fluid and merciless. Within 30 seconds, every threat in the room was neutralized, and he was kneeling in front of Simone, hands shaking as he cut her restraints. Are you hurt? He demanded, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. Did they? I'm okay, she said quickly, though tears were streaming down her face now. Min-ho, I'm okay, just bruises. He gathered her against him, holding her so tightly she gasped, but she didn't pull away. She clung to him just as desperately, her body trembling with delayed shock. Around them, his men secured the warehouse and began cleanup, but Min-ho couldn't move, couldn't release her, couldn't process anything beyond the fact that she was alive and in his arms. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair, the words broken. I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I should have protected you better. You found me, she said, pulling back enough to cup his face with bound hands he was still working to free. You came for me. Always, he promised fiercely. Always, Simone. There is nowhere in this world you could be taken that I wouldn't tear apart to bring you home. She kissed him then, desperate and salt-tainted with tears, and he kissed her back with everything he had, every fear and relief and vow pouring into the connection. His men politely looked away, giving their boss this moment of raw humanity before he had to become the cold strategist again. Later, in the back of his car with Simone curled against him wrapped in his jacket, Min-ho made calls that would reshape Seoul's underworld. Every family that had any connection to her kidnapping would pay. Not just the perpetrators, but anyone who'd known and failed to warn him, anyone who'd thought his affection for Simone made him weak. By dawn, 3 rival organizations would cease to exist, their leadership eliminated, their territories absorbed into his control as a message that would echo through the criminal world for years. Touch what's mine, and I'll erase you from existence. At his penthouse, Min-ho personally tended to Simone's injuries with hands that could kill, but touched her with infinite gentleness. She watched him clean the cut on her lip, apply antiseptic to the bruises darkening her cheekbone, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. Talk to me, she said softly. I failed you, he replied, his voice hollow. I brought this into your life. You could have died because of me. But I didn't, she countered. You saved me. I shouldn't have had to save you. He set down the first aid supplies and turned away, unable to look at the evidence of what his world had done to her. You should leave Seoul, Simone. Go back to Atlanta or anywhere else, just somewhere far from me and this life. She was quiet for so long he thought she'd agreed, thought he'd lost her to the reality he'd tried to keep at bay. Then she said, "Is that what you want?" "What I want is irrelevant," he said bitterly. "What's safe for you?" "I asked what you want, Minho," she interrupted firmly. "Not what you think I should do, not what's logical or safe. What do you want?" He turned back to her, letting her see everything he usually kept hidden. "I want you," he said hoarsely. "Every day, every way, for as long as you'll have me. I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep with you in my arms. I want your laughter and your wisdom and your terrible taste in reality television. I want everything, Simone, and I hate myself for it because wanting you puts you in danger." She stood, cross to him, and took his face in her hands with the same gentleness he'd used on her injuries. "Then make me safe," she said simply. "You command an empire, Minho. Use that power to protect me instead of pushing me away." "It's not that simple," he started, but she cut him off with a kiss that tasted like antiseptic and determination. "Then make it simple," she whispered against his lips. "I'm choosing you. I'm choosing this, knowing the risks. Now you have to choose if you're brave enough to let me stay." He kissed her then with desperation and devotion, lifting her easily and carrying her to his bedroom, to the space he'd never shared with anyone. They made love with new urgency, with the awareness of how close they'd come to losing each other, with promises spoken in touch and breath, and the way their bodies fit together like pieces of a puzzle finally complete. Afterward, with Simone asleep against his chest, Minho made a decision. If she was brave enough to stay, he would be ruthless enough to keep her safe. That meant consolidating power, eliminating every potential threat, building walls around her so impenetrable that even thinking about touching her would be suicide. It also meant finally stepping fully into the darkness he'd been avoiding, becoming the monster completely, so she could exist in light. The next morning, Minho called a meeting of every major family head in Seoul. The gathering was unprecedented, the tension thick enough to choke on. These were men who'd built empires on violence and cunning, who respected strength and exploited weakness. They came because refusing Kang Minho's summons was tantamount to declaring war. "Thank you for coming," Minho said, standing at the head of the table in a private room of his most exclusive club. "I'll be brief. As of today, Simone Clark is under my direct protection. She's not a business associate, not a strategic alliance. She's mine. Anyone who looks at her wrong, speaks to her disrespectfully, or even thinks about using her as leverage will discover exactly why my family has held power in this city for 3 generations." One of the older bosses, a man who'd known Minho's father, spoke carefully. "With respect, Minho, personal attachments are vulnerabilities we all learn to avoid for good reason." "With respect," Minho replied, his voice cold, "I didn't ask for opinions. I'm informing you of reality. Yesterday's incident was handled. The organizations responsible no longer exist. Consider that a demonstration of what happens when someone forgets who I am." He let that sink in, watched understanding dawn on faces that had seen decades of violence. "You've made yourself a target," another boss said. "Every ambitious fool will test this weakness." "Let them try," Minho said flatly. "I'll welcome the opportunity to remind Seoul that I am my father's son." The meeting ended shortly after, the message delivered and received. As the bosses filed out, Minho's head of security approached quietly. "That was a dangerous play, boss. You've essentially painted a target on her back to prove she's untouchable." "I know," Minho said, "which is why from now on, she has protection every moment she's not with me. Best team, rotating shifts, invisible but always present." "And if she objects to being guarded?" Minho's expression hardened. "Then we protect her anyway. Her safety isn't negotiable." Simone did object loudly when she discovered the security detail 3 days later. "I'm not some fragile flower that needs babysitting," she argued in Minho's penthouse. "I've lived independently my entire adult life." "That was before people knew hurting you would hurt me," Minho countered. "The world changed, Simone. You can be angry about that, but I won't apologize for keeping you alive." "So I'm just supposed to accept being watched constantly?" She threw up her hands. "That's not a relationship, Minho. That's captivity dressed up as protection." "Then what do you want from me?" His own frustration broke through. "You say you choose this life, but you resist what comes with it. I can't protect you if you won't let me." I want to be your partner, not your prisoner, she shot back. There's a difference between protection and control. They stood on opposite sides of the living room, the distance between them feeling vast despite being only feet apart. Finally, Minho said quietly, I watched my father die when I was 22. He was killed because someone he trusted betrayed him, used his love for my mother as a weapon. I held him while he bled out, and his last words were to never let emotion make me weak. For 12 years, I built walls so high nothing could touch me. Then you walked into my hotel room with towels and a smile, and those walls crumbled like they were made of sand. He moved closer, his eyes intense. So yes, I'm overprotective and controlling and probably suffocating. But the alternative is pretending I could survive losing you, and we both know that's a lie. You've become the center of my world, Simone, my weakness and my strength, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe, even if you hate me for it. Simone's expression softened. I don't hate you, she said. I love you, you impossible, frustrating man. But love without trust becomes toxicity. You have to believe I'm strong enough to handle your world. You are strong enough, he said immediately. That's not the question. The question is whether I'm strong enough to watch you take risks. Then get stronger, she challenged. Because I'm not going anywhere, and I refuse to live in a gilded cage no matter how much you claim it's for my safety. They stared at each other, wills clashing, until Minho finally nodded slowly. Compromise, he said. You keep the security detail, but they maintain distance unless there's active threat. You get more freedom. I get peace of mind knowing someone's watching when I can't be there. And you talk to me before making decisions about my life, she added. We're partners, which means I get a say in how we handle threats. Agreed, he said, pulling her close. But if something happens and I override you to keep you safe, then we'll fight about it after, she finished, wrapping her arms around him. I can live with that. They sealed the compromise with a kiss that quickly deepened into something more urgent. Minho lifted her easily, carrying her to the bedroom where they communicated what words couldn't fully express, the fear and relief and desperate need to reaffirm connection after conflict. 2 weeks later, they fell into a rhythm that almost felt sustainable. Simone continued working at the hotel despite Minho's offer to support her financially, insisting she needed purpose beyond being his girlfriend. He respected that, though his security team quietly ensured her shifts were the safest possible, that difficult guests were handled before they reached her, that she moved through her days wrapped in invisible protection. In private, they built a relationship that existed separate from his criminal empire. Movie nights where he discovered her obsession with terrible rom-coms. Cooking disasters where her attempts at Korean food made him laugh until his sides hurt. Quiet mornings where she did yoga while he answered emails, existing comfortably in the same space. But the underworld doesn't sleep, and eventually the peace shattered. It started with whispers. A new player had arrived in Seoul, someone connected to the Chinese triads with ambitions and resources. They were making moves on territory, not Minho's directly, but close enough to be concerning. His lieutenants recommended preemptive action. Minho agreed, planning to handle it quietly. Then Simone met David Chen at a hotel networking event. She mentioned it casually over dinner, not knowing the name would make Minho's blood run cold. Nice guy, she said. New guest, staying in the East Wing penthouse. Very friendly, asked a lot of questions about Seoul. Questions about what? Minho asked carefully. Just general stuff, she said. Best neighborhoods, restaurant recommendations. Why? Because David Chen is the triad enforcer I'm currently in conflict with, Minho said flatly. And he just used you to get intelligence on me. Simone's face paled. I didn't know. He seemed so normal, just a businessman. That's the point, Minho said, already texting his security team. He approached you specifically, Simone. This wasn't coincidence. Within the hour, Minho learned that Chen had specifically requested Simone for his sweet service, had orchestrated the networking event to seem natural, had been gathering information about Minho's routines and vulnerabilities. All through innocent conversation with a woman who had no idea she was being used. I'm so sorry, Simone said, visibly shaken. I should have been more careful. This isn't your fault, Minho said, though fury burned through him at both Chen's manipulation and his own failure to anticipate it. But it proves my point. You're a target now whether we like it or not. The next move came faster than expected. Chen requested a meeting, neutral territory, just the two of them to discuss territorial agreements. It was obviously a trap, but refusing would show weakness. Minho agreed with conditions. The meeting took place in a restaurant Minho owned, swept for weapons and surveillance, his men positioned throughout despite the agreed-upon privacy. David Chen arrived alone as specified, impeccably dressed, smiling with false warmth. "Kang Minho," he said in Mandarin-accented Korean. "Thank you for meeting with me." "Let's skip the pleasantries," Minho replied coldly. "What do you want?" Chen's smile widened. "Direct. I appreciate that. I want the Gangnam territory. You want me to stop investigating your girlfriend, seems like a fair trade. Nothing involving her is ever on the table for negotiation." Chen leaned back, studying him. "You know what's interesting? I researched you extensively before coming to Seoul. The Ice King, they call you. 12 years of ruthless efficiency, no emotional attachments, no exploitable weaknesses. Then suddenly, there's this American woman, and you're making decisions based on feelings. It's almost romantic if it wasn't so disappointing." "Your point," Minho said flatly. "My point is you've already lost," Chen said, "because now you care about something more than power, and that makes you predictable, controllable, weak." Minho smiled then, cold and absolutely terrifying. "You're confusing weakness with motivation," he said quietly. "I was dangerous when I had nothing to lose. Now I have everything to lose, which means I'll go further than you can imagine to protect it. That doesn't make me weak. It makes me absolutely merciless." Chen's confidence flickered. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Minho replied. "You approached Simone thinking you'd found leverage. What you actually did was give me a reason to erase you from existence. So here's my counteroffer. Leave Seoul within 24 hours, or discover what happens when you threaten the only thing Kang Minho loves." The meeting ended there. Chen left, and Minho knew they'd reached the point of no return. This would end in blood, the only question was whose. That night, he held Simone close and told her everything. About the conflict, the threats, the reality that loving him meant living in the crossfire. She listened quietly, then said, "What do you need from me?" "Stay close," he said. "Trust my security team. And know that whatever happens in the next few days, I'm doing it to build us a future where we don't have to look over our shoulders constantly." She kissed him softly. "Then do what you need to do. Just come back to me." The war was brief and brutal. Minho struck first, targeting Chen's operations with coordinated precision, cutting off money flows and supply lines. Chen retaliated by going after Minho's legitimate businesses, trying to force him into costly defensive positions. For 3 days, Seoul's underworld held its breath, watching two predators circle each other. The end came in a warehouse meeting that both sides knew would be final. Minho arrived with his full force, no longer pretending this could be solved diplomatically. Chen came with equal numbers, equally prepared for violence. "You could have avoided this," Chen said. "All you had to do was choose power over pussy." Minho shot him in the kneecap before anyone could react. Chen went down screaming, and the warehouse erupted into chaos. But Minho had planned better, positioned smarter, and fought with the desperation of a man protecting everything that mattered. When the smoke cleared, Chen's organization was destroyed, and Minho stood over the man who'd threatened Simone. "She's not leverage," Minho said coldly. "She's my future, and you were too stupid to understand the difference." He left Chen alive but broken, a message to anyone else who might test him. Then he went home to Simone, covered in blood that wasn't his, and let her see exactly who he was when everything was stripped away. She didn't flinch. She helped him out of his ruined clothes, cleaned the minor injuries he'd sustained, and held him while the adrenaline crash hit. "I love you," she said simply. "All of you, even the parts that scare me." 3 months later, Minho proposed on the hotel rooftop where they'd first really talked, presenting a ring that had belonged to his mother. Simone said yes through tears, and he kissed her with the reverence of a man who'd found redemption in the most unexpected place. Their wedding was small, private, attended only by people who understood what their union meant. His lieutenants, her few close friends, and the hotel manager who'd unknowingly changed Minho's life by assigning Simone to his suite. As he slipped the ring on her finger, Minho silently thanked whatever force had brought this woman into his cold world and taught him that love wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing he'd ever known. A year later, Simone stood in their penthouse nursery, one hand on her rounded belly, watching Seoul's sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Minho came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her carefully, resting his hand over hers where their daughter kicked strongly. "She's going to be stubborn," Simone said, laughing, just like her father. "She's going to be perfect," Minho corrected, like her mother. They stood together, the crime lord and the hotel worker, the ice king and the woman who'd melted him, building a future neither had believed possible. Outside, Seoul continued its endless rhythm, but inside this moment, they had everything that mattered. Love had conquered fear. Trust had defeated trauma. And Kang Min-ho, who'd spent 12 years believing emotion was weakness, had finally learned that the bravest thing he'd ever done was let Simone Clark see his heart. Their story wasn't conventional. It was dangerous, complicated, built on foundations that should have crumbled. But some loves are strong enough to reshape worlds, and theirs had transformed Seoul's most feared criminal into a man who believed in tomorrows again. And as their daughter kicked beneath their joined hands, both of them smiled, knowing they'd created something beautiful from the ashes of their separate pains. A family, a future. A love worth every risk they'd taken to protect it. The end came not with violence, but with peace. And for Kang Min-ho and Simone Clark, that was the greatest victory of all.